to us. And it's not that I'm not answering questions. I will happily answer any questions milling around later. But just for the sake of the room hire and those kind of things, that's why. And the fact that we've got Roger here tonight, it really is about him and not me. But I wanted to welcome you, whether you're a member of UKIP, whether you're going to vote for us, whether you know you hate us, but you just want to make sure, whether you're from a rival party and you're thinking, I'm not sure about this whole thing, you're most welcome. You know, we live in a democracy. We live somewhere where different people's opinions are welcome and tolerated. And I've found in UKIP a party that's always willing to take the lid off the box, to have a look at issues that we're not supposed to talk about, and to sort of think, do you know what, maybe this box can be repackaged a bit better. Maybe we can do a little bit better for our country than we've been doing before. That's why I joined UKIP. I felt that my belief in the country I live in as an independent force in the world was being contained by being part of the European Union. I believe in a free country. I believe in a country that can trade with the world, that can welcome other people from the whole wide world to come and live here and to take part and to work. And to do that in a way that we can plan for our services. If we introduce different methods that make sense, we can plan for the infrastructure we need so that we don't have housing estates all over this constituency, where people can't move around because the roads are so congested, where we're giving away our green fields over and over again. We'll never get them back. We're giving them over because governments give us targets for numbers of people in the future that they've got no control over at all. I don't think that's right. I believe that local people are the ones who know what's going on. I believe that local people are the ones that live in an area, that use the services, that use the facilities. One thing UKIP really cares about is having those local voices making the loudest noise. And I believe that that's what this area needs. Now, I'm not somebody who actually really goes in for confrontation politics. The old kind of like bully boys in the schoolyard who are just pointing fingers at each other and saying, oh, you know, you did this bad, you did that bad. I think there's a better way of doing politics on behalf of people. I believe in cooperation. I don't believe in running away. And I feel as though this whole area, this constituency, it needs freshening up. It needs somebody who isn't just enmeshed into the same old system, with the same stale old parties doing the same things over and over again, and nobody really benefiting. So I'm not going to say it's all rubbish, and I'm not going to say the other parties are all rubbish. What I am going to say is that UKIP can make all the difference. And when we win in May, that's exactly what we will be doing. We will be saying to any government that we work with, we will be saying on individual issues from different parties, yeah, do you know what, we think that's a good deal, we will support that. And on other occasions we'll be saying no. And we will offer that fairness and that balance that has not been available to British politics before. And that's what we are all about. So if you're already a member of UKIP, pat yourself on the back, you have made the first step. It's a great thing to be doing. Now, like you, I love my country. I love England, and I love the UK. And one of the main reasons I love it is because I feel as though British culture and British values are to be applauded and cherished. I'm not happy that we give them away. When I travel, and I love travelling, when I go to all different parts of the world, which I've done for business and for pleasure, I enjoy other people's culture. I'm happy to put, plastic bags on my shoes to go into a mosque in Turkey, wear a shawl around my shoulders in a church somewhere else. Of course I am. I'm respectful. I like knowing how other people organise their lives. Well, I would suggest that we have been told that British culture is worth nothing, that it's just dissolving and we just need to be just forget it. Well, I'm not having that, because I think that those values of honesty and integrity and fairness and an open attitude to the world and looking beyond the shores just of Europe, looking to the wider world, like we've always done in this country. We're a maritime nation. We're explorers. We make those paths and those connections. I want those things to continue. That's what the real UKIP is all about. And if anybody is thinking that the message is other than that, let me just tell you, that's the frightened media and the frightened political class doing their job, and that's not the truth. I suppose it's about 3 years ago that I joined. I had no links whatsoever with the party. I have voted for, to my shame, all the other parties in my day. And I know, yes, but we've all got guilty secrets, I'm afraid, in our party. It makes me get to Roger. Because when it came down to it, it didn't really make that much difference. And I suddenly started to think that. I had a bit more time. I wanted to do some good. And that's why I'm here now. I still want to do some good. And those of you that know me already know there is something a bit strange about me. I trained and qualified as a social worker. Then I joined UKIP. I love abuse. Bring it on. I ain't here for the glamour, that's for sure. But I am here because I'm not frightened to stand up and say what I think is right. And neither am I unprepared to listen to the opinions of other people and be flexible and take things on. Because I think that's what politics is about. It's a process of evolution. We're not the same party we were 3 years ago, 6 years ago, a decade ago. We are moving on, and because we are responsive. And that's what it's all about. All the issues that we all know about education, the NHS, which of course we know is being weaponised. What a great phrase is that. You know, how despicable that a service that affects people when they are at the most vulnerable should be used in that kind of a description. Well, I'm sorry, but the Labour Party left me a long time ago. The Conservative Party, I don't recognise it. I think it just blows with the wind. You know, whatever seems to be the right decision to support 1 minute, then that's the way it goes. I'm not happy that today in government, 0.7% of our national income has been ring-fenced for giving away to foreign causes that we don't even know what they are. I am all for helping humanitarian causes, of course I am. I'd rather all that money went to fight Ebola at the moment than just have to be spent on something. Because those somethings also include all the bonuses, all the fat cap perk schemes in many big charities, if you don't realise that. I'm not happy with that. I'm not happy with waste. I'm not happy with some people having stunningly amazing lifestyles when other people have got to choose whether to heat or to eat. That cannot be acceptable in a civilised society. UKIP's about fairness, and that's what I'm all about. And I will fight for those things, whether it's here or anywhere else, because I don't think that if you sell out your integrity, you've got much to offer. Lib Lab Cons sold their integrity long ago. UKIP are here to do good in Eastleigh, fighting this infestation that we've had for too long here, that's complacent politics to the core. We've had enough of it. This is time for a change, a new grum, and that's what I'm offering you. So I hope that I will meet lots of you when we're out campaigning. I hope those of you that joined us today or already members will come and help. And I'm sure that we're going to have a fantastic time between now and May, all over the constituency, in the villages, in the town centres. People understand that even if they've never voted before, UKIP are offering something different. And do you know what? They are right. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to speak, Roger don't speak yet because I've found out all these facts about him I want to share. So it's fantastic to have Roger. Yeah, he is our MEP, he is our energy and industry spokesperson. And he's been in the European Union since 1999.
In the Parliament, yeah.
Absolutely, in the Parliament. So he really does know how the whole thing ticks over. I have to tell you that Roger Helmer did used to be a Conservative. But he saw the light. He saw the light.
3 years ago.
And I think he'll be telling you himself about why he decided to make those changes. But he did go to school in Southampton, so if you're thinking he looks a bit familiar, it could be the case. And he's here to answer Exactly, yes, yes. It's here to answer all of your questions, of course, on what makes energy tick. So, run it over.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Patricia. And my word, I've met Patricia before, but I have never heard her speak before. And I think I now understand why UKIP in Eastleigh has chosen her as the candidate for this constituency. Fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And before I say anything else, I have been asked to make an announcement, and it's not about the fire escapes. The centre has asked us to announce that tea and coffee are available upstairs, but please don't all rush at once. Now, as Patricia has told you, I did indeed go to school in Southampton. My parents moved to Southampton when I was 6 years old, which I guess was about 1950. And I went to Bassett Green Junior Boys School. After that, I went to King Edward VI Grammar School on Hill Lane. And I was there until I went on to university at the age of, I guess, 18. So my formative years were spent here. And I tell you what, I don't come back to Southampton very often, but driving down here and seeing names like Bursledon and Hamble and Totten and all these places, Itchen, that I remember, you know, from years ago. For me, it's a great experience. I'm extremely happy to be here. Now, one thing I wanted to mention to you, because I do remember that it was only just recently that there was the Ford van operation in Eastleigh. I believe it's just outside the constituency boundary, but it's here, okay? And you will recall that that went to Turkey. Yep. Now, 15 years ago, I was very much involved in the debate over the euro and whether we should join the euro. And I've got to tell you, there were lots of business leaders, and I think of one in particular, who were telling us that if we failed to join the euro, we'd be outside the European market, that investors wouldn't want to invest here, that Japanese car makers wouldn't build their cars here, that the financial services business from the city would all move to Frankfurt, and Britain would be done for if we didn't join the euro. Has anybody noticed what's happened to the euro recently? It is absolutely a disaster. And I have to say I agree with Lord Lawson, who said it was the most reckless political adventure of the post-war years. And right across southern Europe, the unemployment rates are fantastic, and the depression that has set in those countries is comparable to the 1930s. It is dreadful in Italy, it is dreadful in Greece, and largely that is the responsibility of the euro currency. They cannot buy their way back into the market, and the QE can't work because it doesn't help countries like Greece and Italy get competitive again. Now, those very people, and I will mention one of them in particular, Mr. Carlos Ghosn, who is the head of Nissan in the UK. I've got a feeling, by the way, that he pronounces it Ghosn, but I don't like the sound of that, so we'll call him Ghosn. And bear in mind that Nissan is in bed with Renault, which is owned partly by the French government, so, you know, maybe there's a bit of incentive there. This guy who was telling us it'll be a disaster and we'll be finished if we don't join the euro, what's he saying today? He's saying it'll be a disaster and we'll be finished if we leave the European Union. The same people are making exactly the same mistake again. And they seem to have this quaint idea that if you're not a member of the European Union, you can't sell stuff there. Well, I've got to tell you, I was at a meeting just, was it only yesterday? Was it Friday today? Yesterday morning in Brussels, I was at a meeting with a delegation of Korean parliamentarians, members of their National Assembly. What were we talking about? We were talking about the free trade agreement between Korea and the European Union. Now, if the European Union makes a free trade agreement with Korea, and I know a bit about Korea because I spent 4 years there in the course of my career, not Korea, it also has free trade agreements with more than 100 countries or is developing free trade, negotiating free trade deals with them. The European Union makes free trade deals all over the place. When we leave, and I do like to say when rather than if because it's looking more and more likely, when we leave, we in this country will be the largest customer of the European Union outside the European Union. We are bigger than America. We buy more stuff from the continent than America does, or anybody else. And also, not only the largest customer in absolute terms, the largest net customer. In other words, we have a big balance of payments deficit with the continent. Now that's a bad thing for Britain, but it means that we are very, very, very important. And if it's true, I don't know whether it is, that 3 million jobs in Britain depend on exports to Europe, I can tell you 5 million jobs in Europe depend on exports to Britain. And those smart guys down in Munich are not going to say, oh, Britain's left the European Union. We're not going to sell them our BMWs anymore. Will they? Hell, no, of course they'll want to sell their BMWs, and of course Nissan will build in the northeast of England and continue supplying them. And the reason I mention that is because, as you know, the Ford Motor Company, which I think perhaps knows as much about motor cars as Mr. Nissan, actually decided to move its van operations from Eastleigh to Turkey, from a country in the European Union to a country outside the European Union, because it thought it could service the European Union market better from Turkey than it could from here. Again, bad news for Eastleigh, bad news for Britain, but there's a lesson there. It completely disproves this idea that you can't service a European market from outside the European Union. I should say, by the way, that after I left Southampton and went to Cambridge and then graduated, and I went all over the place, but in the course of that time, I spent a good 12 years on and off in East and Southeast Asia. And I mention that because some of our opponents tend to talk about UKIP as though we hate foreigners and we are little Englanders and we want to be isolated and marginalised. You hear that phrase, don't you? Isolated and marginalised. Well, I've got to tell you that, as Patricia rightly said, we are the great global trading nation. We are the internationalists. And for me personally, I have spent a huge part of my life, 12 years in Asia, 15 years in the European Parliament, before that working in America and Europe and all over the place. I spent 3.5 years in Malaysia. I was the only Westerner in a business employing over 300 people. Were there any sort of ethnic tensions or problems? There certainly were. They weren't between me and them. It was between the Malay staff and the Chinese staff, and I spent quite a lot of my time trying to sort out those problems and the little jealousies that arose. Anyway, you didn't ask me to come and talk about my career, so I'll talk about energy. I'll talk about energy. They told me I only have half an hour, so I've got to be quick. It's a big subject. I could talk about climate change by itself for an hour and a half, but I won't. You all know about climate change. You can't open the newspaper without reading about climate change. Let me say the first thing, that climate changes, of course it does. There is nobody in UKIP who is a climate change denier. We know that the climate changes. We know that the climate always has changed, and in all probability the climate always will change. So let's get this denier thing out of the way. The climate changes. The world has got slightly warmer over the last 100 years. Anybody know how much warmer it's got?
2 degrees? 1 degree?
0.7 degrees centigrade. That's not a number I've invented. That is the figure that is accepted by just about everybody in the debate. 0.7. And if you talk to the European Commission, they will say, this is such an enormous change in a short time, there must be a special reason for it. And the answer to that is nonsense, because if you look back over the last 10,000 years, this is what they call an interglacial period, because we had an ice age before 10,000 years, but throughout the last 10,000 years, there has been a regular cycle of warming and cooling every 1,000 years or so. And if you go back from now, 1,000 years ago, we had something called the medieval warm period. You know it was warm because the Vikings went to Greenland. Why did they call it Greenland? I'll tell you why, because it was green. You go to Greenland today, it is not green. 2,000 years ago, you had something called the Roman optimum. How do we know it was warm? Well, the Romans were growing grapes by Hadrian's Wall and making wine. Now, I tell you, if you go and start a vineyard by Hadrian's Wall today, you will not get on terribly well. And if you go back 3,000 years, you come to something called the Minoan optimum. There's a lot of evidence out of Greek for the Minoan optimum. And similarly, you go back before that, the Holocene maxima, there has been this steady sort of 1,000-year pattern. And where are we now? We had the Little Ice Age, which was about the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, you know, when Shakespeare was talking about Dick the Shepherd blowing his nail in the cold, icicles hang by the wall. He was in the middle of the Little Ice Age then when he was looking at that. It was very cold at that time. But it's been getting warmer ever since, as part of the same natural cycle. And this is the point that we've got to make as often as we can. Yes, the world is getting warmer. Yes, it is the warmest it's been now since we've had records. But how long have we had records? The Central England temperature record, which is the oldest reliable record that exists, goes back about 300 years. So of course this is the warmest year on record, but the geological record enables us to go back to these earlier warmings, medieval warm period, Roman optimum, and if we look at those, we know that today is no warmer than they were, and in fact, arguably cooler. So we're in a natural cyclical pattern. Nobody believes that human CO2 emissions caused the Minoan optimum or the Roman optimum or the medieval warm period. So why do we believe that human activity is causing the slight warming we've seen now? The other thing you might be interested in is that NASA observes what's going on in space. And one particular thing they've observed is the polar ice caps on Mars. Now those ice caps, as you may know, they're not water ice caps, they're CO2, frozen CO2 ice caps, but never mind, they're ice caps. And they get bigger when it's cold and they get smaller when it's warm. And they have followed exactly the same pattern over the last 100 years or so. They have reduced in size. So far as I know, nobody is driving 4x4s up there on Mars. Now, so the point I'm making to you is that it is obvious if you look at the long period that we have here natural cycles which are driven by the sun and other astronomical factors. Nobody is disputing the basic physics. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but the fact is that it is just one minor factor amongst many other factors, and the biggest factor controlling the global temperature is that big hot yellow thing in the sky which we call the sun. Now they will tell you that 97% of scientists agree that human activity and CO2 emissions are causing climate change. If you read the background to that, the way that research was put together was simply preposterous. They took a whole series of scientific papers, and anything that didn't specifically deny anthropogenic climate change was counted as supporting it. So they ended up with a figure that was absurd. I have actually done a great deal of work with a number of scientists in Europe and in America, including some who have actually been official reviewers of the IPCC work. One of them was Fred Singer from the University of Virginia, a very distinguished atmospheric physicist over in the States. He came up with a famous line. He said, the IPCC accepts my corrections to its punctuation, but not to its science. And I actually went to Chicago Airport a few years ago with a guy called Paul Reiter, who is a scientist from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. He's an expert on tropical diseases. And there's a section of the IPCC report that says the world's getting warmer, so malaria is being found in all sorts of places it wasn't found before. And he said, no, I know about malaria, I know about tropical diseases and other diseases. Malaria is not a disease of warm temperatures. The biggest malaria outbreak in recorded history was in Siberia in, I think, about 1920 or so. So the idea that a warming planet means more malaria is nonsense. Malaria is a disease of poverty and mosquitoes, not a disease of warmth. Okay, so I've made the point about climate change, but let's accept that there are some people, many people, who believe that climate change is real and that it's driven by CO2. So let's forget what I think and what UKIP thinks about climate change for a minute, and just ask ourselves, suppose they're right, suppose it's CO2. Are the things we are doing at the moment to combat CO2 emissions sensible? And the answer is, they're not sensible, and they won't work. And I'd like to tell you why. Let's start with wind farms. Do you have any wind farms?
No.
No?
We've got the only windmill, we've got a working
I like working windmill. But let me tell you why you should worry about wind farms even if you don't have any wind farms in your backyard. You're lucky. I have 4 very large turbines within a mile of my village, and I hate them. But never mind, there are local reasons for opposing wind farms, the noise, the health impacts, the visual impact, and all those factors. But those are local reasons. There is also a national reason, and the national reason is they are driving up the cost of electricity and making it unaffordable for households, and we've heard the reference to the choice between eating and heating, especially old people on pensions having trouble heating their homes. And also, and this is more important and I'll come back to it in a moment, driving up the price of electricity for industry, and that damages all of us. It damages our economy, it costs jobs for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Wind, you may not have noticed, is intermittent. You probably saw the report in the papers 2 or 3 days ago. On the coldest day so far this winter, the whole of the wind sector was delivering about 1% of all the electricity used in the UK. Why was that? because there was high pressure over a large part of the UK and there was very little wind. So when you need it, it isn't there. It's a bit like solar, you know, solar works better, it doesn't work very well at all. It works better in the summer when the sun's shining. When do you need the energy? When it's cold in the winter. So it doesn't work out. But the point about these technologies is they are intermittent. You cannot run a modern economy on intermittent power supplies. So if you're going to use wind and solar, what you have to do is provide what is called backup, which can be any kind of fossil fuel, but most ordinarily is gas. Mostly they use gas for this purpose. So in other words, you have to use the gas to fill in the gaps when the wind isn't blowing or the sun doesn't shine. And you may say, well, okay, that's fine, where's the problem? The problem is this, that anything like a large process industry or a gas-fired power station runs efficiently when it runs 95% capacity all the time. It runs very inefficiently if you are constantly ramping it up from 20% capacity to 80% capacity and then turning it off, but you have to keep it spinning on spinning reserve because otherwise it isn't ready to be used again. That is an inefficient way of running a gas-fired power station. What that means is, for every megawatt of output you get from that gas-fired power station run intermittently, you are burning more gas than you would normally do if it was run properly, and you are emitting more CO2 than you would normally do if it was run properly. And an interesting wrinkle on the evidence for this, in the European institutions, they've recently realised that, of course, if you run a gas-fired power station intermittently, then you don't actually make money on it in the same way as if you have a gas-fired power station run properly. So if you go along to your bank or your financial backers and say, I want to build a gas-fired power station, but it's only going to run 45% of the time on average, you're not going to get the money. The guy who says, mine's going to run 95% of the time, he's the one who's going to get the money. We are now making, in addition to the subsidies to the landowners, in addition to the subsidies to the operators, in addition to the feed-in tariffs and all those things, we are also paying so-called capacity payments to the gas backup guys to make it worth their while running their gas-fired plants inefficiently. That is why the emission savings that you thought you got from your wind power are actually, you do get some emission savings, but they are largely offset by the inefficiency of the backup. One of the things that annoys me most is I get people saying, well, of course we ought to use wind power, it's free. Well, wind power is free in the same way that coal and oil are free. You know, coal's just lying there in the ground. All you've got to do is get it out and burn it. But the process of getting it out and burning it is very, very expensive. The wind is free, but the process of converting that wind into electricity is very, very expensive. It costs about twice as much for onshore wind as a proper power station, and for offshore wind, so help us, it's about 3 times as much. It is extraordinary. And I got a statistic on that because there's a research done just recently. The coalition government, this coalition government that we're so happy with and proud of, has a plan to increase, massively increase offshore wind farms. They're going to put offshore wind farms everywhere. If they go ahead with their plans, as they are currently set out, the cost of subsidising offshore wind by 2020 will be £6 billion a year. 6 billion, a lot of money. And the other little sweetener for this, more than 80% of the proposed installation of offshore wind is going to be foreign owned. So what we in Britain, we in the British economy are doing, we're taking 5 billion of that 6 billion and just sending it overseas. You know, our economy is so strong that we can afford to give away all this money to foreign companies. It is simply preposterous. I won't go into solar in the same sort of detail, okay, but it's also intermittent. It also requires backup. It is subject to exactly the same problems, with one proviso. That is that whereas with wind, I think they are about as developed as they're ever going to get, with solar there is room for development, and maybe in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, solar will have become so cheap that it's worth it despite the intermittency, and by that time we may have thin film solar, which for example will go on the outside of windows of office buildings and apartment buildings and so on. It won't take up good agricultural land with those horrible old-fashioned clunky solar panels that we used to. We in UKIP are not opposed to renewables because they're renewables, we're opposed to them because they're ridiculously expensive. You know, we're very fond of hydro, which is highly competitive and a great way of making electricity, and we will be perfectly happy to support solar when it's actually cost effective. But what we are doing, oh sorry, I wanted to mention biofuels briefly. All heard about biofuels, and the European institutions, the Parliament, introduced rules 7, 8, 9 years ago, saying that all fuel from a certain date that's burned in cars, diesel or petrol, has to be 10% biofuels. Because in those days, we thought biofuels were the silver bullet to solve the carbon problem. You know, you grow the plants, you turn it into biofuel, then you grow some more plants, and the CO2 that you burned goes back into the plants that you've grown, and it's a zero CO2 cycle. Isn't that wonderful? We've solved the problem. We haven't quite solved it, because you can't put much more than 10% biofuels in, but never mind. Then some clever guy realised, hang on a minute, when you grow these crops, you need tractors, and the tractors need diesel, and you need fertiliser, and you need pesticides, and you need all those other inputs that all involve energy. So actually, it's a bit like what I was describing to you, how you don't make the savings you thought you were going to make. When you do your biofuels, actually what you find is that you aren't saving as much as you thought you were, because you've got all these energy inputs in order to grow the biofuels. So people started getting a little bit worried, but they carried on. Then in the last couple of years, they've realised something else. If you go to Indonesia, say, and you say to the Indonesians, we'd like you to plant 1,000 hectares, let's say, 1,000 hectares with palm oil, because we're going to make biodiesel out of it. What do the guys there do? They say, great, it's good business, we'll make some money out of that. Then they go away and they take another 1,000 hectares of rainforest or swamp or virgin land, and they convert it to agriculture, because, hell, those guys got to eat too. You know, you're taking away land they could have grown food on, so they go and grow it somewhere else. This is called, now we love acronyms in the European Parliament, it's called ILUC. Indirect Land Use Change. And now we've realised that we've got this indirect land use change. When you add up the inputs of energy to grow the biofuels, and you add up the effect of the land use change, you find that you're not really saving very much at all. And in the case of some crops, you're actually negative. In other words, you're producing more CO2 than if you just got some petrol out of the ground and used it anyway. So what we've done there is we've said, well, maybe the 10% was a bit rash, maybe we should cut back to 5%. Meantime, people in the industry who've invested very large sums of money in refining capacity for palm oil and for sugarcane to make ethanol, they're suddenly cut off at the knees. They've made their plans, they've invested their money based on a clear European Parliament decision, we're going to have 10% biofuels. Now we go back and say, sorry guys, you can take that refinery away, we don't need that anymore, we're only going to go for 5%. That is the way this thing operates. But the effect of this is that Europe now has, apart from Japan, which is an exceptional case, it's an island with no natural energy resources, apart from Japan, Europe has, on average across the EU, the highest energy prices in the world. Now, the European institutions like to talk about the importance of manufacturing. We've got to get our manufacturing base back. We want to get up to 20%, I think we're about 12 or 13% at the moment. We want to get up to 20% manufacturing. Meantime, the manufacturers are coming to us and saying, hey guys, you know, we cannot afford the energy. We are global investors. We can build a factory or a plant in Europe where the energy costs are very high, or we can build it in India, or China, or America, or South America, or anywhere else you care to name, and get cheap energy. So why are we going to build our plant in Europe? And the effect of that is that we are exporting jobs, and we are exporting investment, and by the way, we are also exporting emissions. So we then look at what Europe's doing in terms of emissions, and we say, this is good. We've got our emissions down 20% on 1990. What we forget is we are now importing loads of stuff we would previously have made, and we are creating those emissions in China and in India and around the world. And so far as the environment is concerned, if you're worried about CO2, a ton of CO2 emitted in Shanghai is exactly the same as a ton of CO2 emitted in Sheffield. Only it's worse than that, because a lot of these countries outside Europe actually have lower environmental standards. And there is actually a government report on the petroleum refining industry, and the government report, British government report, says that on average, imported petroleum products actually emit 35% more CO2 in the course of refining them than if they had been refined here. And I don't have a government report on steel, but I have anecdotal reports from the industry. They reckon typically a ton of imported steel has caused the emission of twice as much CO2 as if you made it at home. So we have a policy that is driving jobs and investment out of Europe we're losing businesses, and we're also increasing emissions. That cannot make sense. Now, I've been saying things like this for a long time, but I've been getting ready for my conference speech in Margate in February. And I thought, well, I keep saying these things, I ought just to be able to nail them down a bit tighter than this. So in the last 10 days, I have had meetings with representatives of the European aluminium industry, the European steel industry, the European petroleum refining industry, and I'm going to meet the glass industry, the chemicals industry, and the cement industry, and I think the issues are all the same. Would you believe that in the aluminium industry, in the last 7 years in Europe, 36% of the smelting capacity that Europe had in 2007 has been closed down, including at least 2 aluminium smelting plants here in the UK, one in close to Wales and the other one up in the northeast. Huge amount of capacity shut down. Job losses, they reckon, across Europe, 42,000 jobs lost. Now you may say, well, okay, but we've had a financial crisis, haven't we? So obviously there's been a bit of a depression in the economy, so we don't need so much aluminium. No, the consumption of aluminium over that period has increased, and therefore imports have had to increase even faster to cover the growth in the market and the decline in local manufacture. So this is a real serious problem. Steel industry, very similar figures. They reckon they've lost 100,000 jobs across Europe, and steel imports are going up. Petrochemical industry, petroleum refining, which is itself an energy-intensive business, they reckon they've lost 10,000 direct jobs and possibly 40,000 indirect jobs. And I haven't seen these other 3 major industries yet, but I am pretty confident that we will get the same story. It is a dramatically bad way of managing the energy business in Europe. And I have to say, it gets worse. And I was involved in the debate on it getting worse this week, because we have a thing in Europe called the emissions trading system, your ETS. You've probably heard about it. It means that if you want to emit, basically you've got to buy permits from the government or trade permits with other people who've got permits, so you've got a permit to emit CO2. Now, whichever way you look at it, that is a bit like a tax. We're saying you will pay more for your energy. In fact, the whole purpose is to make people pay more for their energy, so they will be more concerned about energy conservation, and also it will, they hope, drive the development of low-carbon technologies. Now, the thing is, this ETS system has pretty much failed. They expected the cost of a tonne of emissions of CO2 to start at 25 euros and over the years go up to about 75 euros. In fact, it's been running for nearly 10 years, and for almost all of that 10 years, it's been below 10 euros. So it isn't doing what we wanted it to do. We've got all the costs of collecting the money and recording the stuff and trading the stuff and people making money out of trading it, but still the price isn't enough to do what they thought they wanted it to do. So they've now invented something called the Market Stability Reserve, with the explicit objective of raising the cost of energy. We've already got a disaster. The outgoing industry commissioner, Antonio Tajani, nice man, he's now an MEP as it happens, the revolving doors keep revolving. He actually said, when he was the industry commissioner, he said, with energy prices, we are creating an industrial massacre in Europe. Now that's very strong language for a European commissioner. And when I started digging into these numbers and looked at the number of people who are unemployed, the number of plants that are closed across Europe, I see what he means. We are creating an industrial massacre. We're driving industry out and then wondering why we have economic problems in Europe. So, I'm rapidly approaching a conclusion. Gratified here. What I should say finally, because you're always going to say, well, okay, what's UKIP going to do about it? The first thing is, what we would say is we do not think we should be offering massive subsidies to people who want to put up wind farms and solar parks and so on. Or indeed subsidising people who want to make biofuels. We want to cut back on those subsidies. We've nothing against renewables, but they've got to stand on their own feet, on their own pricing. They've got to be competitive. When they're competitive, fine, you can have renewables. The next thing we will say is we want secure and reliable sources of energy, and that would mean coal, gas, and nuclear. Those are the mainstream baseload ways of generating low-cost, reliable electricity, which will drive our economy and make sure that pensioners no longer have to choose between heating and heating. That is the way to go. We have wasted vast amounts of money on layer after layer of incentives and taxes and feed-in tariffs and all this and that. We want to cut through all that, get rid of it, and just get back to the basic business of turning fuel into energy in an effective and economic way. It can be done, it should be done, other countries around the world are doing it. Why aren't we doing it? We aren't doing it because the European Union is obsessed with this climate change thing. And when you say to them, look, you're making us uncompetitive, they say, never mind, we are negotiating with other countries, and other countries are really interested in putting in the same sort of system and controlling their CO2 emissions. Well, we know what happens, America, China, and so on. They talk a good story at these conferences, but do they do it? Of course they don't do it. There's a lot of nonsense. If you look at America, they've actually reduced their emissions, not by over-investing in renewables, but by the simple procedure of getting a lot of shale gas and burning it instead of coal, because shale gas produces less CO2 than coal. So other countries will not join this thing. Other countries will not destroy their economies just to make Europe feel better. We have to do what they do instead of hoping that they will do what we do. If we follow that route, we believe we can deliver secure and affordable energy for homes, for households, for pensioners, but also, vitally, for industry. And that is essential if we are going to see economic growth. The European economy is in a terrible state, and most of the reasons for that are self-inflicted. The two obvious ones are the euro currency and the energy policy. They are disastrous, and the sooner we get out, and the sooner we get away from the European energy policy and have a rational energy policy, the better off this country will be. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. I mean, I don't think we're, there's no way we could have got that massive information without having somebody who's actually on the ground there dealing with this all the time. So I know Roger's very happy to answer questions if you just want to do a simple hand raise and I'll, point to you. You, sir.
Yeah, I'm Paul Cadger, Romsey UKIP. I noticed you didn't mention shale gas until the last furlong of your speech. I can understand why. Have we got a kind of a take on shale gas for UKIP?
Yeah, okay. I know this is a problem. Normally in UKIP, we respond to what people want by saying, yeah, we'll do that. And we are right to do so because what people want generally makes sense. But there are one or two areas, like shale gas, where there has been this avalanche of negative propaganda in the media. And bear in mind that this is not only driven by green lobby groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. I like to say they're not friends of the earth, they're enemies of the people. They're driving it, but a lot of commentators think actually that Russian money is also supporting the anti-shale gas campaign because, of course, Russia depends upon exports of oil and gas to survive, and is in terrible straits at the moment because the oil prices come down. That's another story. So there has been this vast amount of negative propaganda, and naturally people read it in the paper and they become concerned. I don't blame them for becoming concerned. But I've been to America, I've been to Pennsylvania, and I made a separate trip to Texas. In both cases, I looked at shale gas operations, I talked to local people. They don't say, oh, this is horrible, and our water is disgusting, and we get earthquakes coming from the shale gas operations. I tell you what they say. They say this town was dead alive 5 years ago, and look at it now. New hotels, new restaurants, new businesses, new people coming in, house prices going up because people come in for the shale gas industry. And then you go and look actually at a shale gas site. Now, I would agree that in the initial stages, for between 3 and 6 months, you've got an area the size of a football pitch and you've got lots going on. But when that phase is over, for the next 20 years, when you keep pumping gas from that well, you actually have, you'll find it on my website, in fact, a photograph of it. You have a thing that's about that big, and like that with some pipes. I stood beside one, and it was actually about as tall as I was. And I thought, my word, compare that to a wind farm. Which would you rather have within a mile of your village? The other comparison I like to make, I represent the East Midlands, and in Nottinghamshire we had coal mines. I think there's one left. Of course, Yorkshire's just a little way up the road. They had a coal industry. And when the coal industry closed down, they were absolutely devastated. There were whole communities who suffered. And they got very angry with Margaret Thatcher. We can have a debate about whether they were right to do that or not. But the fact is, They lost the coal industry and it was a disaster. What we have now got is a new industry to extract energy from under the ground, which offers the same economic potential as the coal industry, but no thousands of men sent underground for 30 years to get pneumoconiosis, no enormous slag tips and enormous workings that you associate with the coal mining industry. The occasional earth tremor, and they really are very small and very occasional from shale gas, is less than the earth tremors you get from coal mining, because you get earth tremors from coal mining. In fact, you get subsidence from coal mining as well. In almost every respect, shale gas is cleaner and safer than coal mining. And if you're worried about CO2 emissions, for the same amount of energy, you only get half the CO2 from gas. And what I think we ought to be doing is explaining that to people and saying, this is like North Sea oil all over again. This is a huge opportunity. And what we in the party are saying is that whereas with North Sea oil, we took the proceeds of North Sea oil and we spent them as we went along, so there's nothing left now. What the Norwegians did was they took the money from their North Sea oil and they established a sovereign wealth fund. And they've now got a sovereign wealth fund that's worth, if I remember, something like 1.5 times Norway's GDP, which is an enormous sum of money for future generations. We believe that we should take that approach with shale gas in the UK, and that at least some of the proceeds from the shale gas operation should develop a British sovereign wealth fund, which will help our children and our grandchildren and may help pay for the National Health Service.
Anybody else like to ask a question?
You talked a little bit earlier about the sort of establishment supporting this wind energy and stuff like this. I mean, is it true, because I've kind of done some research on this, is it true that they've actually got sort of friends within the establishment that are in control of like selling this stuff as well, which is why they choose not to sort of mention it, because they're financially gaining from it themselves?
Well, that is, I'm not sure that's the main driving force, but it's certainly a factor.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the phrases that an economist would use about wind farms is that they are regressive. And what that means is they take money from poor people and give it to rich people. You know, if you've got a pensioner couple living on their pension, struggling to pay the electricity bills, the money that they're spending on their electricity is actually going to rich landowners and rich investors who built wind farms as part of the subsidy process. And of course the classic example is that David Cameron's father-in-law has a large estate, lost, I think, do you remember the figure? He's making about £1 million a year, I think it is. Yeah, it's published, if you just Google it, it'll come up. He's making a ton of money out of it. So it is true that rich people are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer because of wind energy. And that's another reason why we don't like it.
Harry.
Roger, as you know, I'm in second stands BBC in Bradford West, in the heart of Yorkshire.
Yeah.
You're saying that our dependency in the UK has got to come from coal, gas and nuclear. And if people are allowing the backyard kind of shale, which is the ideal thing. What do you think about the coal mines at Yorkshire and Lancashire being recommissioned? Is there a possibility that they can be recommissioned?
First of all, a quick anecdote, if I may. One of the problems for the coal industry is you have to plan ahead. If you're running out of coal seam and you want to open a new coal seam, that is a big investment that won't start to deliver for 2, 3, 4 years. So you need to have some idea that when you've created this new coal seam, you're going to be able to sell the coal. At the moment, the coal industry is looking at George Osborne's carbon price floor. That's another one of the complicated devices they put in to try and raise prices in the industry. And they are saying to themselves, we don't know where that's going to go, so we don't know if people are going to want to buy our coal. So we can't open a new coal face, which is really a sort of death knell for the industry. Now, going to the general question, I would dearly love to be able to say to you, to this meeting tonight, our policy is to reopen the coal mines. I'd love to say that. The fact is that deep mine coal in the UK, generally speaking, is pretty expensive. And because of shale gas, American coal is terribly cheap. And I don't think we're in the business of saying coal-fired power stations in Britain have to pay 3 times as much for coal as they need to in order to keep that industry alive. On the other hand, I don't think American coal is going to stay that cheap for that long. So if we continue to burn coal, and I think something like 28% of our energy at the moment comes from, you've got 1% on a bad day from wind, you're getting 28%, if I remember the figures right, from coal. So coal is still big. People think coal sort of went away, it's old-fashioned stuff, nobody uses coal anymore. Actually, it is a major component. I would like to see that maintained and if you ask me for a quick sort of split, I'd like to see a third nuclear, a third coal and a third gas, that sort of split. Because if you split it between different technologies, you're less vulnerable to price changes and supply shortages and so on. And I would love to be able to see a situation where we could use British coal, and obviously if we have a significant coal sector in the energy generation industry, there is always that potential because oil prices change and the balance of prices change.
In the same line, this asked you, we became slaves, coal for gas-wise, to gas being brought in from Russia, through Europe. North Sea gas, North Sea oil would have made us self-sufficient and secure in this country.
Yep.
Why did we not go down that route of having security for this country and rely on Russia, for example, who could just turn the tap on?
Well, we did in fact exploit North Sea oil and gas, and there just wasn't enough of it to keep us self-sufficient and secure forever. In fact, there wasn't enough of it at any point to make us entirely self-sufficient. I think we were exporting oil at one stage, weren't we? But basically, that supply from the North Sea is going down and getting more expensive as it gets more difficult to find. I mean, the North Sea has taken a huge hit from the change in the oil price. When oil was at $120 a barrel, it made sense to invest in the North Sea. When oil's at $60 a barrel, it doesn't. But we're not actually in this country. Although Europe is using, I think 30% of European consumption is gas consumption is Russian. Very little gas burned in the UK is actually Russian. We're getting gas from a variety of sources, from the Middle East and from other places. We're also starting to bring in liquefied natural gas, which obviously comes on ships and you can take it wherever you like. But you're absolutely right. We need to cut dependency on imports anyway because of the balance of payments and so on and so on. But we especially need to cut our dependence on places which are politically unreliable and can actually use the gas weapon as a threat, like Putin. I've got a couple of questions here that were submitted before. May I just briefly?
Whilst Roger's looking, I know that we've got representatives here from solar powered industry. Does anybody want to ask a question, Roger? If you do, then put your hand up.
I do, but not solar.
Okay, well I just know that there are people that have such connections, and I want to make sure you've got that chance if you want it. That's all. Yes, indeed, yes, sorry, I can't see. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you tell me what, if any, research or investigation has been done onto the use of hydropower?
Well, hydropower is a long-established technology. I mean, it doesn't really need an awful lot of research. We understand very clearly how it works. The problem with hydropower is you've got to have the sort of geography, the sort of terrain that allows you to do it. Typically sort of mountains, mountain lakes, streams. If you've got much flatter country, it's more difficult. Scotland, you know, there's some pretty good opportunities for hydropower, but most of the good opportunities have been taken up, and some in Wales. Across most of England, you don't have that, and while you can put small generators in local rivers, you know, that's maybe a good idea and helps the local village, but it's not a major source of power. So hydro is good, but I think we're getting hydro wherever we can get hydro, and it just depends on the geography. You need water that's high up that you can run down hills.
What about tidal?
Tidal is fabulously expensive, even more expensive than offshore wind. We hear about tidal lagoons, we hear about wave power.
Yep.
All these theoretically work. They are just fabulously expensive, I'm afraid. Nothing beats good old petrol.
It's just another question.
This is something that's been buzzing around my mind for the last 40 years. Every time we pulled a chain, we were flushing away energy. Because down sewage plants, one of the biggest problems is methane gas.
Yep.
Has any study been done in the fact of collecting this waste and converting it into methane gas and burning it off on whatever you want to need to use, running plants on the methane gas that's coming off it?
I know there are lots of projects around the place with methane gas from various sources, including sewage farms, also anaerobic digestion on farms. I'm not honestly an expert on that. I can't give you chapter and verse in detail, but I believe it is being looked at. Also, landfill. If you've got landfill, everything down there rots, and methane is given off. if you worry about global warming, methane is much worse than CO2, about 30 times worse than CO2, I think. So it's a good thing in both, you know, if you want to stop greenhouse gases, then it's good not to release the methane into the atmosphere, although I'm afraid all those cows all over the place are releasing methane like nobody's business. And if you can collect it and burn it. Now this is another thing, you see, people hate incinerators, but waste incineration with energy recovery is a fairly logical thing to do. You just have to put it somewhere where it's away from centres of population, where people are going to be unhappy about having it there.
Well, yes, but no, gas from sewage, because all you need is put it back to the area.
Oh, I know, yeah. There, you just have to collect it.
And it's an endless source of supply.
Yeah.
Also,
As long as we had, sorry, could I just, sorry if I may, could I just address these? Mr. Kenneth Cart, who is extremely keen on nuclear power. All I would say is we too are extremely keen on nuclear power, but we don't believe that it can be exclusive. The question suggests that we can use nuclear power and nothing else. I think that would leave us too dependent on one technology. How do we challenge the Green Party on the issue of climate change when the science is inexact? That was a good point, yeah. According to today's paper, only 38% of scientists agree with the assertion that 2014 was the hottest year on record. You've all seen the banner headline saying 2014 was the hottest year on record. You may like to know that it was actually 0.02 degrees, they say, warmer than the previous warmest year, but in fact the error of measurement is actually much larger than 0.02. So within the limits of measurement, it is the same. And anyway, if you accept that climate is cyclical and we're looking at a new 21st century warm period, well, you would rather expect temperatures to go up, wouldn't you? And the fact is that they are. There's another question that doesn't really pertain to climate. It's about small business owners and corporation tax, and why are we wasting so much money on foreign aid and other waste for the government and the EU? Well, I mean, our party position on that is very clear. We think we're spending far too much on foreign aid. We think we should focus a smaller amount of money on the relief of immediate disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes. Fine, we'll send tents and serum and all that stuff, but we should not be saying 7% of GDP because that's daft. And similarly with the EU, it's costing us about 20 billion a year in direct payments, but it's costing us probably 100 billion a year when you look at the regulatory costs, and we don't think we should be paying that. We think we should be keeping that money at home. Could I just take the gentleman at the back first, because he had his hand up earlier?
Thank you. My question is, do you not think it's time for some serious money to be put behind the development of water-fueled engines?
Well, every so often somebody writes to me about a water-fueled engine. I have never seen one, and nobody's been able to explain to me the physical principle by which you get the energy out of water.
Right.
So, you know, there are all sorts of good ideas, like cold fusion.
A lot of people have actually made machines that run on water. I don't understand the science of it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I hear that, but nobody's ever shown me such a machine. I would think that if anybody had a machine that they could wheel in here and say, look, we're going to get...
I have an article here, lifted off the internet, of 5 inventors who mysteriously died.
You get these conspiracy theories.
Well, conspiracy or fact?
Well, you get conspiracy theories saying that the moon landings were filmed on a backlot in Hollywood and that the Twin Towers were brought down with the CIA. You know,
I would really encourage you to, and the audience, to actually Google water-fueled machines.
You can Google anything and you find all sorts of strange stuff.
Yes, and there are lots of people. But my point is that if it can work, if it does work, surely, as an energy person, couldn't you actually capitalise on being a driving force in bringing this about?
Well, with great respect, two things. First of all, we're a political party. We're not inventors, we're not investors, we're not utility companies, okay? The second thing is, if we go for way out things that look to people who've got physics as though they're conspiracy theories, and we say UKIP is backing water-powered engines, I honestly think
there's a difference between UKIP backing it and UKIP saying openly with the other political parties saying that this needs to be investigated. this needs to be invested in.
I haven't even seen the evidence that there is something there to investigate yet, but if there is the evidence, I'd love to see it, and you know...
Well, I've got the handout, so I'd like to leave with you at the end.
That's good, thank you.
Roger, I'm sorry, I can't share your enthusiasm for share. And the reason is, if you, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do, first of all, but if you care to look at what's happened, the large swathes of North America, where people have undertaken this fracking, people have made an awful lot of money. The money has been sloshing around in communities, and the communities are devastated. It has increased alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide. It's a result of people having an awful lot of money very quickly, and the communities have been unable to cope with the change. And it's mostly Indian type tribal people that are suffering, and they're actually leaving these areas now because they can't live there anymore. Suicides have increased. So it's not just gung-ho to say that, you know, fracking and shale will solve all these problems, because it won't.
Well, I'm grateful for your input, but you know, as I say, I have been to two separate large shale fields in America. Well, I haven't been to Idaho, but yeah, I've been to Pennsylvania and Texas. I can't go to all the states in the US.
Well, they're devastatingly small communities.
But if we are saying that economic development gives people more money and they spend it unwisely, you know, I don't think we therefore reject economic development.
Well, it depends who gets hold of the money.
Well, I mean, the government can have some influence over that, probably have too much influence over it. But all over the place, there are new industries arising, new jobs being created. I think the general, well, there will be jobs. I mean, in any shale field, there are lots and lots of jobs being created. I think the problem particularly, and you mentioned the American Indian communities, this has happened with a whole load of things. You know, they decided they were going to operate casinos in the Indian reservations. And as a result, a lot of people got a lot of money and didn't work for it. You know, it was just, we will give the tribe so much money to do this or to do that, or they will get 10% of the proceeds of the casino, whatever it is. I appreciate that's a problem, but it's a social problem. It's not really a show gas problem, I think. And I think we've handled it better in the UK. Sorry, question at the back.
Hello, Roger. Excuse me. Earlier you spoke about the nuclear.
Yes.
Successive Conservative and Labour governments have sat on their hands and done nothing about building some new plants, because they're all, or most of them are very, very old and coming to the end of their lives. What do you propose that we should do about because it takes about 15 years to build a new site. What do you propose to do about that?
Well, good question. Of course, we have an absolute crisis because you're quite right, we do have aging nuclear plants that are reaching the end of their lives. We also have coal-fired power stations that are being required to close down by the European Union's large combustion plant directive. And I don't think that Ed Davey, God help us, has actually got a grip on that question, has any idea where in 10, 15 years' time that energy is going to come from. But you're also absolutely right that successive governments of both flavours have let the nuclear industry run down. And the result of that is we don't have the skills, we don't have the students studying nuclear engineering, we've kind of let the whole thing stop. And that's why we have to go to the French, because they didn't let it stop, they've kept building, they've kept operating nuclear, and they have lots and lots of people who understand it. And I hate it that we have to go to the French and ask them to do it for us, but it's that or not get them at all. You remember it's Gordon Brown who sold Westinghouse, a very viable nuclear business. He sold it, I think, first to the Americans and they sold it to the Japanese. It's still there, it's still operating, but it was a British business, it's not a British business anymore. We have to start from the ground up, we have to start somewhere, and it's right to start building new nuclear power stations, although I disagree with the deal, the government. We could spend a long time talking about why they've ended up with a very high price. It doesn't have to be that high. The other thing is, you mentioned it takes 15 years to build a nuclear power station. It does today. The first one we built at Calder Hall took 3 years. And I think we've become risk averse, we've become absolutely obsessive about planning processes and so on. And the result is that nuclear power stations are now much slower and much more expensive than they really need to be. And I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. I'm not technically qualified to address it, but it's if I were sitting in Ed Davies' desk, I would get some very clever civil servants and industry specialists to sit down and say, why does it take so long and cost so much money to build nuclear? We want new nuclear, we want it more affordable, and we want it faster. The Americans are working on modular small nuclear reactors, which might be a way forward. And the technology is developing, new generations coming through, and eventually we see nuclear fusion, which is quite different from nuclear fission, and is likely to be much cleaner when it comes, but it probably won't come in my lifetime.
All right. Thank you, Roger.
Lady Bianca, in front of me.
I was just going to say that I got South Shore quite a lot, and when I look on the beach, I can see on the left there's Ostsea wind farm, and then if you look on the right, you see offshore, oil rig.
Yep.
So if I was going to vote in there,
Yep.
does it mean that these oil rigs will come up and all over the country, and I think they're just as much
No, there's only any point in putting an oil rig where there's some oil. And we don't have an awful lot of oil in the UK. We had oil in the North Sea, but as I was saying earlier on, the North Sea oil fields, unfortunately for us, are starting to run out. And because of the price of oil at the moment, although there is some more oil there and you could sink some more oil, it's getting prohibitively expensive to do so. So I don't think that there's any question of building lots and lots of oil wells. As I say, shale gas is a different thing and is much smaller and less intrusive.
Hello, Roger. I actually operate a renewable energy company, and I might ask you two questions. First of all, if you were in power, what would you do with the feed-in tariff?
Yep.
And the second question I want to ask you is a totally different add-on.
Yep.
Because 3 years ago, the big six energy companies were making a profit of £48 per household.
Yep.
This year, they're going to make a profit estimated at £89 per household. What would you do about that?
Well, okay. The first thing is running a renewable energy company and feed-in tariffs. We in UKIP believe in the rule of law. If somebody has made a commitment to a particular installation, a renewable installation, with a contract that says they get a feed-in tariff for 25 years or whatever it is, we have to respect that. I mean, I'm sad that we have to, but I think that's the only decent thing to do. And think of the number of votes you lose if you say, sorry, we're going to take your money away.
If you came to power tomorrow,
Yeah.
you can, from that date, stop it, couldn't you?
We would not offer any new.
That's what I'm going to
Not offer any new. Yeah. That's what we would stop. But I think in the case of solar, very soon there will be price competitive solar. I don't think wind turbines are going to. No, you're into solar. I mean, the thing that upsets me about that is I have people writing to me. It's really heartbreaking letters. The guy wrote to me and said, look, I was made redundant, I took my redundancy money, I took out a second mortgage on the house, I started a little business for solar installation, I hired a couple of installer operators, I trained them up properly, I was ready to go with this business, and then the next day the government cut in half the feed-in tariff. And, you know, I really felt terrible for the guy, but there's nothing I can do about it except to write back and say how sorry I was, but also to say, and I would advise anybody on this, never build a business on a government commitment like that, because they can change it tomorrow, and they do. Yeah.
So what about the second question?
Sorry, remind me again, I'm getting old.
3 years ago, the big six energy companies were making a profit of £48 per household in this country. This year, they're estimating they're making £89 per
Yeah. What I think you've got to do, and I haven't got the figures honestly, and I must dig them out. It's not the amount per household that counts; it's the return on capital employed. I'm always hearing people tell me, you know, these people are making outrageous amounts of money, and when you look at it, they're making sort of 6% return on capital employed, which is probably what Tesco is making. I haven't got the latest figures there, so you know maybe they're making 12% now. I don't know. But the other thing I'm concerned about, we are asking these companies to make major investments in new infrastructure. I was just saying, with all these plants closing, we want them to build new plants. You can't ask people to build new plants, but at the same time say to them, by the way, you can't make any money out of it. And the real folly, of course, is Ed Miliband, who announces a price freeze. The first effect of that is that all the utility companies maintain prices higher when they could bring them down, because they're terrified that the Labour government will put a price freeze in. But the other thing is, if you're going to control the prices that utility companies get, you're just not going to get investment. They're going to go to other places to invest their money. You know, the world is there. So it's something that needs to be looked at, and I'm sure that
You're never ever going to cure poverty.
no, if we had a UKIP government, very well, we might, or we have to live with some government, we would certainly want Ofcom to look at that. But we wouldn't necessarily assume that they were ripping folk off until we looked at the numbers and made absolutely sure of that. And what I'm concerned about is that politicians like Ed Davey and all those guys, and Ed Miliband, who was responsible for the Climate Change Act in 2008, they are desperate to blame somebody else for high energy prices when the great bulk of the high energy prices result from their green policies. And that means, of course, from Brussels' green policies. Sorry, one point I was going to make in my earlier remarks and I didn't. A lot of people who don't agree with UKIP say, oh, you guys, you blame everything on Europe. The odd thing is, you just take issue by issue by issue, like energy prices, and it is Europe. Europe had their climate and energy package in 2008, which was immediately picked up by the British government with the Climate Change Act. It's a Brussels policy that is causing the damage. So I'm not apologising to anybody for putting the blame on Europe, because the blame is fair and square in Brussels.
I personally think that if we some Europeans have on us to East Europe, so I want to see the rest of the world, how well we do
On our own.
on our own.
You're absolutely right.
Because then they've all won.
Yeah.
There's only two people there quite around.
With the CCL charges, do you not think it's about time that it's actually just changed to the word tax? Because it goes into the tax coffers, it's not ring-fenced in any way, shape or form. The climate change levy tax.
Oh yeah. Well, it is a tax.
It is a tax, yes.
I mean, we've got lots of different taxes, they all have names, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not actually kept for climate change. It just goes into the big pot, like national insurance,
It's a stealth
income
tax.
It is a stealth tax, and do you not think really, again, politically, it'd be clearer and more open to actually say it is a tax, and we're going to call it tax?
Well, absolutely, yeah. It's a bit like national insurance. National insurance is another kind of income, a second kind of income
Do you not
tax.
think that we should have a bit of a march though on some of the other political parties to actually call it what it is,
Yeah.
instead of trying to bamboozle the general public?
Yeah.
I think we'll take, is there one more question from anybody who's not had a chance to ask the lady in the doorway?
Going back to the shale gas, how much water is used, especially some parts of the south are short on water in the summer?
Okay. Well, it's difficult to give you an exact figure, although I do have a wonderful quote from America. In America, which has very large shale gas operations, there is more water used on golf courses to water the greens than is used in shale gas. The other thing is the industry, and I've discussed this with them, are very aware of public concern on the issue. They are doing two things. They're finding ways of getting shale gas using less water to start with, and they are finding ways of recycling the water when it comes out. And both of those, I mean, the whole, like any industry, it's a very new, fairly new industry, it's been going for 50 years, but they are looking at ways of doing things better. There have been a few incidents of breakages, not of pollution coming up from the actual fracking operation, but from contamination coming out of cracked pipes. And they've done a huge amount of work on double and triple casing, metal and concrete. And so in a whole range of areas where concerns have been expressed, they're working to improve the situation, and water is certainly one of those. And I would stress, I mean, if you look at any major industry, there are always problems of one sort and another. You look at fossil fuels, anybody remember the Buncefield explosion? Yeah, enormous. I think it was the biggest peacetime explosion in Britain ever. And that was nothing to do with shale gas and nothing to do with nuclear and so on. It was just good old-fashioned oil. I did a debate 3 or 4 years ago now at the University of Exeter, and they were talking about nuclear safety. And I did a study of how many people had died in the major energy generation industries. And the answer for coal is nobody knows, but at least 250,000 people around the world had died in the coal industry, And according to some estimates, millions more have died of respiratory diseases as a result of the emissions from coal-fired power stations. Coal, hydro. Now everybody thinks hydro is clean and cuddly and safe, don't they? At least 250,000 people have died in hydro accidents, including, I think it was about 170,000 in the 1980s in one accident, dam accident in China. So you've got hydro and coal, which have caused enormous numbers of deaths. How many people have died in the nuclear industry? The answer, I checked with the WHO, is, well, they said the death toll may eventually reach 100, taking into account people who were affected by Chernobyl, which was, what, 20-some years ago, but it hasn't yet. 3 people at 3 Mile Island, was it? In fact, all the fuss about Fukushima that resulted in Germany closing down its nuclear fleet, nobody died, actually, of a nuclear cause. Thousands died of the tsunami and the water, and in the Fukushima plant, I think 3 people died, but from physical accidents, like stuff falling on their heads and so on. I understand that nobody has died, actually, of radiation. Now, people may yet die of radiation, which is very sad, especially those brave men who went in to sort it out. You know what they did? They collected a bunch of older Japanese workers, and the older Japanese workers said, well, we probably haven't got that many years left anyway, so we'll take the risk, which I think is wonderfully brave of them. But no deaths so far. There may be some, but it's a limited number. Nobody wants anybody to die, but hundreds compared with hundreds of thousands gives you a measure of how safe nuclear is.
I think we've worked Roger quite hard, don't you? So can I say thank you so much on behalf of everybody for coming and doing this. I know Roger's got to go in a moment, but we've got a raffle, so I'm going to let Roger go, do the raffle. If you'd like to buy a ticket and you haven't done, it's a great way of contributing, and we've got a lot of costs coming up. We would be very grateful. And then we've got about sort of like 20 minutes or so milling around. If you want to talk, say anything to me, please come and say hello. That would be lovely. We'll just do the raffle first. After we let Roger go, because I think you need to be on your way. And four of us
When I was a teenager, there was a mainly big boy by the name of Son. The little son was a genius. And I saw on his drawn, up and down the drawn, a million two-stroke running on water. He started it up with a